Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll get started.
This story begins in the main character's home country, namely the Kingdom of Bran, and she had no rights. As a princess, of course, no one even took her opinion into account, and all the people around her felt it necessary to point out to her that she was nobody. The poor girl was constantly beaten, especially since she was the first princess who had all the privileges in that place. The young girl started yelling at her and said that she had left the room and she was not allowed to do so, so she decided to punish her by hitting her with a stick. Princess Christa looked at her with a completely emotionless gaze and said only one word: thread. As soon as the girl heard this, she was immediately very surprised, and this made her even more angry. She asked what she at all means. Christa, meanwhile, began to get to her feet and said that she needed embroidery thread. She didn't have any made, so she decided to go out and get it herself. The girl, of course, was even more alarmed by all this, and she immediately asked, "Is she really doing embroidery?" The girl raised her voice at Christa again and said that even if the embroidery was beautiful, it didn't change the fact that inside she was still the same dirty person who didn't deserve anything. In fact, when a person turns 12, he receives a divine gift. Namely, so was established in that world. Growing crops is the ability to farm, high sewing skills are the art of cutting and sewing, and absolutely every person, when he was at that age, received some of the abilities. There was also an increase in military power. It was called strengthening of physical strength. And the divine gift of Christa's father, who was also the king of the Kingdom of Bran, was the control of water, a rather rare but no less important gift. And the divine gift of her mother, the late queen, was beautiful singing. She had such a wonderful voice that she could enchant everyone around her. And the divine gift of stepmother Christa, who was now queen, was charm. The woman, grimacing, began to walk away from her and said that this time she would forgive her. However, next time she would better ask someone else and not appear in her sight anymore. But then she suddenly thought about it and realized that even if the girl asked someone about it, they probably wouldn't listen to her. But she wasn't interested in it at all, and she considered it Christa's personal problems. The girl nevertheless took the threads for herself and returned to her room, closed off from all people, which was located at the very end of the estate, so that no one would see her. And so, when she was sitting by the window and continued embroidering her picture, she suddenly heard a knock on the door. Of course, same, Christa. A little I was surprised, but allowed log in. Immediately after that, the door to the room opened, and an incredibly handsome blonde boy looked in, greeting his older sister. Christy immediately turned to him and without even smiling told Elmar to come inside. The boy was positively glowing with joy. He immediately started to approach his sister and asked if she had finished her embroidery, because he couldn't wait to see the result. However, Christy said in a rather detached voice that she still had a little time left, so he would have to be patient for a little while. In fact, Elmar was not the kind of person who wanted to wait for a long time, so he came up and asked his sister to show him now, because he was impatient to see what she was embroidering. Christy didn't want to argue with him, so she showed him her embroidery, and it had a picture of a dove holding a piece of good luck in its beak. As soon as the guy saw it, he immediately beamed with joy and could not believe that she had actually embroidered a dove for him. And the girl explained that it was because he loved these birds. Elmar, continuing to smile, said that this was to be expected from her, because she understands him better than anyone and is ready to make him happy under any circumstances. The girl continued to embroider, and he said that he had had a sword dance lesson that morning and he would like to share his impressions of it. Christy was quite focused, but she was going to listen to him. And the guy said that he was going to show his favorite sister a dance that he learned, and he wanted her to appreciate it. In fact, Elmar was the son of the current queen, as well as the crown prince of the entire country. Even though they had different mothers, he still loved her like his own sister in the world. Elmar's divine gift was fencing skill, and he was truly incredibly good at it. The boy stood in the middle of the room to demonstrate to his beloved little sister the dance he learned in class. He was gifted with a divine talent for excellent swordsmanship. In Christie's kingdom, Bran, where art is respected, the crown prince's sword dance was very popular. The opportunity to demonstrate fencing skills in a sword dance is a guarantee of peace. After the boy finished demonstrating what he had learned, Christy immediately applauded and said that he was a great guy and that it was great. Elmar, of course, immediately became embarrassed, but then he said that he still made a small mistake when he performed this dance, so it was not perfect. He explained that he should have practiced more before showing it to her, because now he felt very uncomfortable about it. But Christy replied that he shouldn't worry about it because she didn't even notice anything, so he didn't have to worry. Elmar suddenly became indignant, frowned, and said that he had actually always told her that she shouldn't spoil him like that, otherwise it could even turn against him. At this point, Christy continued her embroidery and said that she understood everything. From now on, she would be much stricter with him, since he was asking so. Elmar suddenly felt very upset, because she said this phrase in such a cold voice, so he said that there was absolutely no need to be so strict with him. Just don't praise him too much. In fact, in front of her stood the conflict-averse, very kind Elmar, who would have a hard time in life because people are cruel. However, no matter how lonely Christy was in the castle where she lived, no matter how much everyone around her despised her, Elmar was her only ally on this cruel path. When the girl didn't answer him, he immediately came closer to her and sadly asked his sister if she was angry. He immediately fell to his knees and, bursting into tears, asked her for forgiveness, telling her to always remain so kind and understanding and that she should not be strict. Of course, even Elmar's presence filled Christy's heart with warmth. So turning to him, she smiled slightly. As soon as he saw her carefree face, he immediately became offended and said that it was very cruel to deceive him in this way, because he really began to worry. Christy, meanwhile, stood up and, coming closer to him, immediately asked for forgiveness from the bottom of her heart and soul. Elmar was the kind of person who couldn't stay angry for long, so he smiled happily, turned to her, and said that, of course, he forgives his beloved little sister. In Christy's opinion, Elmar was the only child who deserved to be loved by everyone. He, more than anyone else, deserved to be happy in this world. Several days passed from that moment, and Elmar suddenly took Christy with him to his father. Of course, all the servants who saw the two of them walking along the corridors were immediately very surprised and began whispering because they did not understand how the girl could even leave her room. Christy felt uncomfortable about this. She turned to her brother and said that she thought it was not a good idea after all, but the boy was not going to listen to her. He walked with a confident step and said that since their father had called them, they could not help but go. He held Christy by the sleeve, but she tried to stop and said that she wasn't actually invited to this meeting, so it was a bad idea. Then Elmar, turning to her sternly, said that it seemed to him that the conversation would be about their country. Therefore, the princess should also be present at this meeting, so he was not going to accept any refusals. When they finally got to their father's office, he said that they should go in quickly, otherwise they would be late, and then they would definitely be scolded. However, before the boy could open the door, he heard a loud cry from his father's assistant, who asked if this meant a declaration of war. Elmar was worried, but he still opened the door and saw his father sitting in the middle of the hall on his throne, and nearby were other people who had also been invited to discuss all of this. The assistant, suddenly becoming worried, asked if this really was the Heartland Empire. One of the nobles, who was just then discussing this whole situation and was on his knees, said that there could definitely be no mistake. He explained that their neighboring Heartland Empire had suddenly attacked a village in their country. As soon as Christy heard about the Heartland Empire, she was very surprised, immediately became wary, and began to listen to this whole conversation even more attentively. The nobleman replied that they had not only robbed the village, but had also killed all the women and children. Of course, for many this news was simply horrifying, because everyone knew perfectly well that they were supposed to be allies. The brother and sister who were still standing at the entrance heard the terrifying whispers of the aristocrats, who understood how terrible it all was and could not believe that the empire was actually starting a war. At this point, the assistant turned to His Majesty and immediately asked what they were going to do. Of course, the king could not answer. Then one of the nobles asked what would happen if the crown prince or Mars, the master of fencing, fought against the enemies. As soon as the children heard this, they were horrified. Christy couldn't believe that someone actually came up with such an idea. However, the aristocrats immediately supported this idea and said that since he had talent, then of course he could easily win. After all, this was an incredible power that was granted by God himself. Christy couldn't believe that they were actually talking about little Elmar going to the battlefield. After all, he was only 14 years old, and they wanted to send him to war. Of course, she understood perfectly well that it was simply terrible to force such a kind child to fight, to harm people, to kill them, and make them suffer. Christy knew that Elmar would simply break down after this and would never be the same again. She understood everything, but she could not accept this situation in any way. Therefore, she really hoped that her father would stop all these terrible conversations and not take away from her the only person with whom she could communicate normally in the castle. However, the king at that moment agreed with the people and said that, in that case, they would send the crown prince to the front. The people around immediately rejoiced, but Christy was not as happy as everyone else, because she understood perfectly well what would happen now. Elmar, who had been standing motionless all this time, suddenly grabbed her by the sleeve and, smiling slightly, said that everything would be fine and she shouldn't worry. Of course, she tried to remain calm in front of him, so that at least he wouldn't get upset about all this. However, the day when the troops set out came too quickly, and Elmar was determined to fight for his country. Despite his young age and little training, he went to the battlefield. Of course, Christy couldn't dissuade anyone, neither her father nor Elmar himself. She wanted him to return safely no matter what. It was hard for the girl to even think about the fact that this wonderful and happy man could see the grief that awaited him in the war. However, most of all, she hoped that at least nothing would happen to him. But in reality, Christy had no idea then that Elmar would never return. The day they said goodbye was his last. Several days passed after Elmar set out with his army. Information about the enemy gradually began to become clear, and Christy learned more about what was happening outside the castle. One day, a letter arrived stating that the enemy general Elmar was fighting was the second prince of the Heartland Empire. This second prince was a ruthless warrior who was driven only by the desire to expand his territory. He did not care about the victims or who he fought against. Even though his divine gift was kept secret, Christy believed that it had something to do with the war. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so famous. Elmar was only 14 years old, and even if he had the ability to master swordsmanship, his kindness could be used against him on the battlefield. Putting him in charge of the army was, in her opinion, a questionable decision. Christy, of course, hoped that she was simply overly nervous and overwrought. However, without Elmar, she suffered from loneliness. Day after day, no one came to her, and she did not talk to anyone. No one in the castle respected her anymore or considered her a person. Her food was brought to her by a maid who clearly hated her job. She would put the food right on the floor, knock on the door, and quickly leave, avoiding communication with Christy. Christy opened the door only after the footsteps had died away. She took her meager portions of food, stale bread, and a few pieces of moldy vegetables. She understood that there was no point in worrying. Her nerves could not help Elmar in any way. All that was left was to immerse ourselves in the world of books and hope that Elmar would return as soon as possible. Of course, there were things Christy could do even in her isolation. She decided to gather materials for possible negotiations with the Heartland Empire. The girl was serious and studied many history books in order to somehow help her brother. She kept thinking about how she would pamper Elmar when he returned. After all, he deserved it more than anyone. One evening, while staying up late writing, Christy saw something strange outside her window. Taking her eyes off the parchment, she looked outside and noticed a light that was getting closer and closer to the castle. Looking closer, she realized they were soldiers. They brought news of war and looked exhausted and lost. The guy who usually looked so alive and energetic was now just lying on his horse and could barely breathe at all. Christy knew something was wrong, so she quickly stood up, forgot about her inhibitions, and ran out of her room. She needed to gather more information. She walked through the estate, constantly looking around so as not to bump into anyone, and especially not her stepmother. And then suddenly, approaching her father's office, she saw these warriors entering inside. The king, seeing the speaker in such a terrible state, immediately asked what had happened and why he could not even move on his own. He looked very agitated. They didn't even close the door behind them. Having seated one of the warriors on the sofa, the other immediately began to report on the situation that had occurred. The knight, trembling with fear, reported that their army had been destroyed by a sudden attack from the Heartland Empire army. His Highness Crown Prince Elmar was shot and killed in this brutal battle. Few were able to escape alive. As soon as Christy heard that her brother had died, she couldn't believe that it was really true. She was about to fall to the ground, but then she suddenly heard the scream of her stepmother, who could not believe that they had really lost the crown prince. The king and other aristocrats immediately turned to her side and did not even know how to comfort the mother who had lost her child. Christy blushed at this point. She knew that this simply couldn't be. The girl didn't know how this could happen because she believed with all her heart that he would survive. The girl covered her ears so as not to hear all these screams from her stepmother anymore. She did not understand how this could happen because not even a week had passed since the army had set out. Then her emotions got the better of her, and she unceremoniously ran into the room and ran up to the knight, who miraculously managed to survive. The girl, not paying attention to anyone, sat down on her knees next to them and asked in a trembling voice, "Could it be that the man who was shot really was Elmar?" The boy, holding his side where he had been wounded, answered in a trembling voice that it was indeed so. Then he handed over the handkerchief that Christy had given him with the dove embroidered on it and said that it was the thing that had been left by the deceased. The knight also said that his highness was heading to negotiate the release of the military, but at that moment he was wounded by a treacherous arrow from the enemy right in his back. His body was left simply lying at the bottom of the cliff, where he fell from his horse, and his enemies only grinned and rejoiced at their victory. The knight handed the girl the handkerchief with trembling hands and explained that it was tied to the reins of his favorite horse, which remained standing on the cliff. Christy immediately clutched the handkerchief and pulled it towards her. She didn't understand what she had done, and why, when the boy was being sent off to war, She hadn't insisted on her own. Now the girl blamed herself for his death, because she should have said that he shouldn't go there. She should have brought strong arguments so that Elmar would come to his senses. Even though his opponent was the merciless second prince, thanks to his merit, this child was killed by a traitorous arrow right in the back. Christy could not believe that poor Elmar had actually been killed. This cheerful boy who always smiled, laughed, and made her happy every day was now lying at the bottom of the cliff, completely cold and alone. She could not stand it any longer and finally gave vent to her feelings. The girl continued to sit on her knees and cried loudly, all the time thinking only about her brother. Her stepmother was completely calm at this moment. She stood next to the king for a while and simply watched this. Well, then she turned to Christa and in a cold, ruthless voice told her to go to the battlefield and kill the second prince of the empire. As soon as the girl heard these words, she was immediately very surprised, then looked at her stepmother and could not believe that she was actually saying this. But the woman, coming closer to her, said that she would thus repay the kingdom of her brother for the favor shown to save her life. The woman screamed loudly, looked Christy straight in the eyes, and asked if she understood everything. The girl said in a trembling voice that she understood everything and would do as needed. At that moment, she plucked up her courage and realized that with her divine gift, she would be able to take revenge on the second prince of the Heartland Empire for her dear brother. Some time had passed since then. The girl had already gotten ready and went to a place near the border of Kowloon's territory. There were only ruins around. The buildings that had once been homes for small children were now only shelters for wounded knights, or places from which they could attack. Christy walked with one of the locals who decided to take her to the knights, and when she saw a small child who, together with his sister, was bending over the dead body of his mother, she was simply horrified. Of course, the girl knew perfectly well that war was terrible, but now that she had seen all this horror with her own eyes, she could not believe that things had really come to this. The girl had read a lot about the situation in the country, but she didn't think it was that bad. As soon as one of the locals led her to the forest, he suddenly stopped. He pointed in that direction and said that if she went through that forest, she would be able to reach the enemy camp. He also thought that the enemy general, the second prince, was also there. Christy immediately said that she understood everything and also thanked this kind gentleman for accompanying her. At that moment, the girl was incredibly confident in herself and her abilities. She went into the forest, but then suddenly a local resident asked her to stop for a while. He asked in a trembling voice, "Is she really going to go into the enemy camp alone with this, a woman, and without an escort?" He considered this act completely reckless. However, Christy said in a completely calm voice that she would not have any problems, since she also had a divine gift, like everyone else. At that moment, the man slowly began to approach her, clenching his hand into a fist, and asked what kind of divine she had. But the girl, throwing a hood over her head, replied that it was for his own good not to know about it, since it was kept secret, like a disgrace to the state. So it was better for him not to even think about it anymore. This man did nothing to her, so Christy calmly went into the thick of the forest, making her way through stones and trees, in order to find that camp and kill her sworn enemy. However, when she suddenly came out into one of the clearings, she saw a lot of knights who were just lying there. They were all dead. No one had even taken their bodies. Christy stood there frozen for a moment. She knew that things were even worse at the state border. The girl also thought that Elmar was also here. He fought, defending their empire, and did not rest until the last. So the girl got motivated by thinking about her brother and immediately hid in the bushes because she heard someone walking nearby. She looked out and saw soldiers of the Hartman Empire. So the girl immediately took off her hood and decided to act according to the plan that she had thought out in advance. Christy walked straight towards them and asked the soldiers if they were hungry by any chance. The men immediately noticed her and were a little surprised, but they were not at a loss and immediately approached the beautiful lady closer. There were 3 of them, and they all immediately started licking their lips, asking if she was from Brother's Kingdom, and one of them added that she must have some courage since she was trying to trade on the battlefield. But Catherine already wanted to say that she was a citizen of their empire, but she didn't have time because the man didn't listen to her and immediately hit her right in the face with his fist. When the girl fell to the ground from the unexpected blow, he immediately laughed and said that he had scored a clear hit. Christy, meanwhile, spilled all the food that was in her basket and felt a strong pain on her face. When they looked more closely, they saw their national food and immediately came closer, taking these sandwiches. The men smiled and said that she must really be a citizen of the empire, so one of them, delighted, said that in that case they could eat them with peace of mind. The men, without thinking twice, immediately began to eat this food, while Christy, meanwhile, continued to lie on the ground and waited for the effect. In fact, her gift is a closely guarded secret known only to a small group of people. When the food began to enter the stomachs of these soldiers, they began to choke, and their mouths filled with foam. After this, they all fell down dead. In fact, Christie's gift was an ability bestowed upon her by God, namely the divine gift of deadly poison. After the girl saw that it was all over, she immediately stood up, wiped the blood from her forehead, and looked with great disgust at the soldiers who lay dead. In fact, the fluids in her body are deadly poisonous and lead a person straight to death. The bread was spread with her diluted blood. This certainly does not kill, but it will cause great suffering to anyone who comes into contact with her blood. Christie, meanwhile, fell to her knees and began to ask for forgiveness, after which she took her basket and went on to look for their most important person. Of course, she never thought that the day would come when she would be able to use this disgusting gift in public, but she had already made up her mind, and therefore she was not going to back down. Christie will use all her strength and lead the second prince to death to avenge her dear brother, who died the most horrible death. After some time, she finally reached the camp where the enemies of her empire lived. The sun had already begun to set behind the horizon, but she understood perfectly well that she had come to the right place. Christie, coming closer, saw a tent with the imperial coat of arms and realized that it belonged to the second prince. Looking around, she noticed that the soldiers had already relaxed considerably during the whole day, and no one was even properly guarding the territory. Some of them even sat and played cards while drinking, thus entertaining themselves. Christie sat and watched the whole situation for a while, and came to the conclusion that there was no unity of morale in the army. The empire boasted great military power, but they also had a weakness, namely, that they were not a united whole. Everyone fought for themselves. Christie sat in the bushes for a while until it got completely dark outside. Then she made her way to the tent and noticed that there was only one guard there. The girl understood that she would be able to get there if she forced him to touch at least a drop of her blood. Christie plucked up her courage and was about to go, thinking about how she would repay her brother Elmar, but then suddenly one of the knights appeared behind her. He turned to her in surprise, pointing the gun straight at her throat, and asked what she was doing in this place. The girl knew perfectly well that things were going badly for her now. When she was only one step away from revenge, everything went wrong. She slowly turned towards the soldier and immediately thought that he was most likely from the patrol. Then she said in a low voice that she was a merchant from the Empire and had come to this place to sell food for everyone's dinner. Christie wasn't sure if it sounded plausible enough, but she had no other options. The soldier stood and studied her for a moment, then told her to slowly turn to face him. The girl knew she had to do it, so when she turned around, she was incredibly surprised. And that's all because Wonderful found out of this human being. Christie noticed that the man was wearing the imperial crest, which meant that he was indeed the second prince himself. The man stood and looked at her for a while. When she wanted to say something, he moved closer to her and grabbed her by the clothes. He asked in an angry voice, "Does she really have the audacity to address members of the imperial family without due respect?" When he finally let go of Christie, she immediately began covering her face with her hands and apologized for her behavior. She understood that she was now in the hands of a man who was Elmar's sworn enemy and on whose orders the boy was killed. Of course, she wouldn't mind if he wounded her right there, but this armor would certainly not allow her blood to touch his body. She sat there and was very worried, not understanding what she should do now. She needed to somehow come up with a new plan, and very quickly. The second prince stood there for a while, holding her hand and looking her straight in the eyes. But soon he turned around and said that he would let her go this time, and also advised her to return to where she came from. He also told her to follow him because he would take her to a safe place so that no one would hurt her along the way. As soon as Christie heard this, she was genuinely surprised. She couldn't believe that he was actually going to let her go without even killing her. Of course, she followed him, but she still couldn't understand how this was even possible, because the second prince is a cruel warrior who leaves almost no one alive. She assumed that most likely, having changed his location and moved away from his knights, he would try to kill or rape her. And so she thought that since there was such a chance, she had to go. She herself was going to kill him, so she silently obeyed and followed the man. When they had walked quite a long distance, she became very curious about where he was taking her, since he had not said a single word during all this time. And soon, when they came to the clearing, the man suddenly stopped and said that from this place, she would enter the safe zone of the kingdom of Bran, the territory of Kowloon. He also said that he didn't know where she was from at all, and advised her to return home from that place and never come back. When Christie heard these words and saw his gaze fixed on her, she was very surprised. She couldn't believe that he had actually gotten her to safety, but even if he had, she didn't understand why. The place where they were was a battlefield, and she had suspiciously violated the boundaries. So the girl did not understand at all why he was letting her go without finishing the job. She stayed there for a while. They stood near the lake, and Christie asked him why he hadn't killed her. The man was silent for a while, And after that, he wanted to answer something, but then suddenly he felt a strong pain in his chest. The pain was so intense that he couldn't even stand on his feet. He fell to the ground and breathed heavily in his armor. Christy, who was standing nearby, watched everything that was happening in surprise and did not understand why he suddenly fell to the ground. After another short silence, he asked her to leave him and go away quickly, because there was no longer a place for her in this forest. However, the girl, of course, was not going to leave. She was incredibly curious, so she only came closer to him and asked what had happened. She assumed that he might be injured or pretending to do something nasty to her. However, the prince, suddenly getting to his feet, told her to be quiet and leave quickly. But Christy was not one of those people. She began to remove his helmet. The man was very scared and wanted to resist, but he did not have the strength to do so. And when the girl took off the helmet, she said that everything was fine and asked him to let her look at it. She knew that she had absolutely no idea what was going on, but she decided to take advantage of the wonderful opportunity to take the helmet from him and make sure that at least a little bit of his skin was visible. But as soon as she saw his appearance, she was very surprised. The guy, despite the fact that he was covering himself with his hand, but she was still able to examine him closely. Christy did not expect at all that she would see such a man, who was completely different from all the rumors that circulated around his personality. For a while, she just stood there silently looking at him, not understanding how this was even possible. In fact, the second prince was strong in battle, and his divine gift must have been related to war. With such a gift, his body must have been very strong. However, now that she sees him grabbing her chest, she couldn't imagine that he could be so weak. Even though the boy was uncomfortable with all of this, he still couldn't contain his pain and grimaced because of all of this. Christy, who was watching all of this, realized that he wasn't even able to fight. Then the man suddenly raised his voice again. He looked very agitated and told the girl to leave quickly. Christy was horrified. She still remained where she was, not understanding what was happening, but she desperately wanted to know. The man began to rise to his feet, still holding his heart, and asked, "Can't she hear?" Then he looked at her with an angry look and told her to leave right now, otherwise he would take and kill her, not slowly. Christy, hearing this, was horrified. She saw this piercing look and icy voice. It even began to frighten her. But she realized that everything was true. Even if he was weak, this man was an enemy general. It was this man who suddenly attacked and killed her brother Elmar. She decided to take advantage of this great chance to set him up, because if not now, she would never have such an opportunity again. So Christy, coming closer to him, turned to Mr. Noah and said that in gratitude for him saving her, she would very much like to kiss him. As soon as the guy heard this, he was genuinely surprised and didn't even try to hide it on his face. But the girl, without even waiting for an answer, immediately put her hands on his face and began to move closer to kiss him. Noah was about to say something, asking what was going on, but he didn't have time because at that very moment Christy touched him with her lips, and he didn't understand how that was possible. The girl kissed him very passionately, licking his lips with her tongue, and all because all the fluids in her body were deadly poisonous. Not only blood, but also tears, saliva. Absolutely everything can kill a person in an instant, so Christy did not stop and continued to kiss him. After some time, when she saw that his grip was weakening, she thought that this was the end for him, and mentally said goodbye to Elmar's enemy. She began to move away from the man, but then suddenly, to her surprise, he grabbed her and pulling her towards him began to kiss her in response. Christy was incredibly surprised. She couldn't do anything and didn't understand what was going on at all, or why he suddenly decided to kiss her back. For a while she did nothing, but then, moving away, she said that she was against it. However, the man didn't care. He grabbed her by the back of the head again and pulling her towards him, continued kissing her straight on the lips. Christy didn't understand why he didn't clean up her saliva, because it was always poisoned, but it seemed to only energize the man. He continued to kiss her longer and longer. When this continued for several minutes, the girl realized that it could not go on like this any longer, because her strength was leaving her. She tried to move away from him, but it didn't work because his legs continued to hold her in their hands. Christy looked at him with a tired look, and immediately realized that this man had drunk her deadly poison, and on the contrary, began to look much healthier than before. She didn't understand how this was even possible. But at that moment, Noah, clearing his throat, licked his lips and said that it was delicious. Christy looked at him in surprise, but then suddenly he grabbed her by the shoulders and started shouting again, asking what she had done to him. The girl herself was very surprised. She asked, "Does he really want to know what she did to him?" In fact, she was very interested in asking this question because she did not understand why he did not die and began to feel healthier after her poison. Noah even looked at her with some disgust and asked why she suddenly started kissing him. Christy was a little surprised by this question, but after that she pulled the hood over her head again and walking away, said that she had answered that she wanted to thank him for his help. That was it. That's why I did it. This. Of course, she couldn't let it be revealed that her goal was, of course, to kill him. The man, as if not believing her, immediately followed the girl and, approaching her ear, asked in a quiet voice, "Is this really the real reason for her actions?" Christy understood perfectly well that he suspected her. But then, she decided to play the role of a crazy lover in front of him in order to at least make her behavior a little more believable. So, turning to him, she took his face in her hands again and said that the thing was that she had loved him very much all this time, and this kiss had been her oldest dream. As soon as Noah heard this phrase, he was very surprised. Of course, it was hard for him to believe that some stranger could love him, especially considering all the rumors that were going around about him. Since Christy didn't know why her poison had no effect, she had no choice but to give up killing indefinitely. Noah looked at her with a little confusion, but Christy, of course, couldn't just come back without achieving success, so she decided to create some kind of connection with him. The girl looked him straight in the eye and said that her name was Christa, Akunaite von Branstetter, and she is the princess of the kingdom of Bran. After that, lowering her head down, she said one phrase that incredibly surprised the man. In fact, this phrase meant a code that was known only to members of the royal family. Noah immediately removed his hands from her and asked what the real princess was doing in this place. Christy replied that the truth was that she had wanted to meet him for a long time. Despite the fact that she was asked to stay at the border, she could not stay, and therefore went all the way to this place in search of him. Noah, of course, didn't trust her and didn't know how to react to the whole situation, so he just remained silent for a while. After that, he sighed heavily and said that it was simply impossible, because this place was a battlefield, and it was not a place where a princess could come even without an escort. So waving his hand, he asked her not to give absurd excuses that wouldn't even sound like the truth. Christy at this point began to approach him and said that the princess could not freely meet with her lover, so she thought that now was a favorable moment for this. She looked him straight in the eyes and said in a confident voice that she would do anything for him. But then Noah suddenly replied in an icy voice that it was the Empire that killed her brother, and he did not understand. Could she really fall in love with the man who led the army of this empire? It was incredibly difficult for Christy to say these words, but she replied that the sisters and brothers of the royal family were related only by blood and certainly had nothing spiritual in common. Of course, it was incredibly humiliating for her to flatter Elmar's enemy, but since it was in order to destroy him, she was ready to endure it. The man just sat and looked at her for a while, then said that she had said that she would do anything. With a smile on her face, Christy said that it was indeed so. Then the man, taking her hand, came closer and suggested that in that case, they get married. As soon as the girl heard this proposal, she was simply horrified. She asked, "Is he really talking about a real marriage?" Noah, still holding her hand, replied that, of course, that was who he meant. Christy hoped that he was just joking, because talking about marriage immediately after confessing was a little strange for her. So the girl took her hand away from him and asked him if he thought it was all happening too quickly. The man continued to insist on his own, saying that since she loved him, then of course there should be no problems, and they could calmly get married in that case. Christy was horrified, but she understood perfectly well that most likely with such actions, he was trying to check whether she was lying. So she replied that it was impossible for a prince and princess of warring states to marry during a war. If he had at least stopped the war, then maybe they would have had some chance of doing so. Christy continued to sit on the ground, holding his helmet in her hands and trying to understand what would happen next. Noah, meanwhile, having come closer to her, said that in that case he would stop the war. These words sounded enough confidently and believably even. She looked at him without taking her eyes off him and immediately asked, "Is this really true?" The man replied that the Empire's conditional goal is gold mines located near the border, and if there is an opportunity to consistently mine gold, then the Emperor does not care about any means. Using the marriage as a pretext to restore the alliance, they would simply have to give up 80% of the gold they mined, and then everything would fall into place. When Christy heard this condition, she was very surprised. She didn't think he would be so greedy, so she asked if they could agree to at least 60%. Noah sighed and said he would find out, but he said she shouldn't count on it. Then Christy bowed, made a reverence, and said that they would help them out a lot if everything went like this. She also replied that it would be much better than losing the country or the mines, and added that in that case, she would try to convince her kingdom to do the same. Noah looked at her suspiciously and asked if she really had any plan for how this could be implemented, when she replied that the whole point was that she would need his assistance in all of this. Christy explained that in exchange for a steady supply of gold, the Heartland Empire would protect the kingdom of Bran. And if they could conclude such a military alliance, then everyone, of course, would agree to it. Noah, having heard all this, thought about it and still agreed with her, saying that these were the right words. Then he began to leave, telling her that in that case she should convey the current conditions to the king. In 7 days he would come to the castle to hear the final answer. As soon as Christie heard this, she was very surprised because she did not think that she would have to wait so long. But he, looking at her briefly, asked, "Are there really any other problems that she would like to discuss?" The girl understood perfectly well that thanks to all this, she would be able to stop the connection with this man and end the war. But she would not be able to come to terms with the fact that she would marry the enemy of her beloved brother Elmar. Before he finally left, he approached Christie again and said that he wanted to express his gratitude for her visit. He lifted her face higher and again asked Princess Christie to marry him. The girl looked at him without taking her eyes off him, but remained silent the whole time, not knowing what to do. The prince began to be alarmed by this, and he immediately asked what her answer to this question would be. The girl believed that the reason why her deadly poison did not work was because of the divine gift of this man. Therefore, in that case, she said that she understood everything and agreed to this marriage. She simply had no choice but to stay close and seek out his gift, and wait for the opportunity to then take revenge on him for the death of her dear brother. Then, before leaving, the man bowed and said that he very much hoped for her cooperation. Christie, smiling, said that it was mutual, and she thought that until then, she would continue to deceive him, and she did it quite professionally, as she herself could already notice. In fact, even after his death, Elmar received an incredibly strong love from his people, and despite this, he had a very modest funeral. Of course, Christie was shocked that this happened at the funeral. Only a few people showed up, and they were close servants. The girl did not understand why Elmar had to die, and she knew that it was simply terrible. And his mother, of course, was also in grief and sorrow, and did not understand how this could happen. However, this woman also had evil thoughts. She believed that it would be better if Christie died instead of her dear and beloved son. As this funeral was taking place, Christie returned and went to her father and stepmother, saying that she needed to tell them something. Immediately after the girl returned from the forest, she, without even changing clothes or resting, went straight to her parents in order to report the latest news to them. Father, of course, looked as if he could not accept the terms of the end of hostilities. But for the sake of protecting the kingdom of Bran, he simply had to agree to this decision. He turned to all his assistants and told them to prepare his daughter for the wedding as splendidly as possible. In his opinion, they should not fall flat on their faces. They were going to show all the determination of their country in this way. So Christie was really just a gorgeous bride. They picked out the most charming dress for her, as well as incredibly expensive jewelry, of which there was a lot. When the girl looked at herself in the mirror, she realized that for the first time in her life she was wearing such a beautiful and luxurious dress. It was too good for her, so she hoped that it would not last long. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she knew she had to think differently. This dress she was wearing was a real revenge costume, so it had to be luxurious. The worst thing about all these wedding preparations for the girl was that she was doing all this together with her stepmother, who disliked her very much. The woman sitting behind the charm asked, "Is she really not ready yet?" and also asked the girl to decide quickly because she was tired of wasting time on all this. Christie immediately apologized to her for waiting, after which she came out to her and said that she liked this dress the most. Her stepmother didn't even look at the girl. She just looked at her manicure for a while and thought about how to do something nasty. Then she turned her gaze to Christie and asked, "Does she even like these frilly sleeves?" The moment Christie looked away to look at them, the woman simply picked up her cup of coffee and poured it right into her face. The girl certainly didn't expect this. She immediately asked with a trembling voice why her stepmother had done this at all, since now her dress was stained. However, she only smiled with disgust and said that the girl was indeed incredibly stupid, and asked how she could even think about becoming a daughter-in-law for the Heartland Empire. And besides, her fiancé could not possibly be that very second prize. So the woman also said that, of course, she could not allow this to happen, so she would do everything to prevent it. Her stepmother, smiling, began to lick her fingers from the remains of coffee on them and said that this image suits her so well that it's even funny. Christie was as if she had been dropped into water at that moment. She looked at her stepmother with great surprise and did not understand. Did this person really want to mock her so much even now? However, that was not all. The stepmother suddenly took and pushed the girl so hard that Christie fell to the ground and hit her head. And the woman just continued to stand there, pleased, and looked down on her, saying that she didn't need to be so afraid. At that moment, she took out her punishment stick and, swinging it at Christie, said that she would simply serve out her deserved punishment, and that would be the end of it. Without thinking twice, she hit the poor girl, who was completely defenseless, with her stick. A loud scream was heard from Christie, and also blood splashed, because the blow was really very strong. The stepmother screamed angrily, saying that, despite the fact that Elmar had died, she dared to return without killing the enemy. The woman did not understand how she could not fulfill the one and only request that was required of her, having such a cursed gift. She also said that in her opinion, she does not deserve to live at all, but for some reason she will not die, even after all those hunger strikes and torture. Then the stepmother kicked her in the back with her heel and asked why, if Elmar was dead, such lowly people as she were still alive. She considered this a great injustice that needed to be fought. Christy was lying on the ground at that moment and couldn't believe that this was really happening, although she shouldn't have expected anything else from her stepmother. The woman continued to beat her with everything possible and all the while screamed for her to die. But at that moment, Christy realized and remembered that she was not getting married to become happy. So even a luxurious dress could not overshadow all the horrors that she had to endure every day. The stepmother beat the poor girl to such an extent that she even lost consciousness for several hours. But when Christy began to wake up, she noticed that she was in a strange place. Looking around, she didn't understand where she was. There were chairs and a lot of chains around, and the lighting was very poor. And after a while, Christy realized that this was a torture chamber. Her hands were tied to a pole, so she couldn't even move. But this thought, her unbelievable, strongly scared. She was alone for some time, after which two people came to her who helped her stepmother. They bandaged her completely and even put a gag in her mouth so that she would not scream. These horrible men poured ice water on Christy, and she couldn't even move to protect herself. That's all her beautiful dress was torn and very dirty. After the water, of course, came the whips with which the men beat her. Christy just stood there and looked off to the side, wondering how much time had passed since she had entered this torture chamber. These men beat her almost to death when one of them hit her in the face so hard that blood immediately started flowing. Suddenly appealed stepmother Christy. With pleasure and a smile, she said that they should not aim at the same time, because if blood flowed, they would be in big trouble. The man who subjected the poor young girl to all these tortures said that he was very well aware of this, so he would not touch any of her body fluids under any circumstances. At that moment, another man approached the hot fire and, heating an iron rod there, approached Christa in order to put a seal on her. The girl was scared, because she understood perfectly well how much pain she would now have to endure. And when the man touched her skin with a hot iron, she tried to scream so loudly, but it was difficult for her to do so because of the rope that was in her mouth. Her stepmother at this point continued to stand and just laugh. She was actually enjoying Christy's suffering very much. The girl understood perfectly well that in this way, the queen was pouring out all the pain from the loss of her son onto her. When red, baked skin appeared on Christy's chest, her stepmother smiled and said that now it would be a very ugly scar that would suit her perfectly. However, they heated up the piece of iron again and began to approach the girl, and the stepmother said that compared to Elmar's suffering, this would still definitely not be enough. The girl couldn't believe that she would have to go through this again, but she couldn't resist. Her hands and feet were tied, and she just had to endure it. After all this, the stepmother ordered them to let her go. Christy fell to the bottom of her cell. She whined and cried and screamed in pain because she did not know what to do next. And the stepmother took her people with her, smiling, and said that they would finish for that day, also adding that she informed His Majesty that she was punished for missing the bride's preparation. Before her stepmother left, Christy asked in a trembling and hoarse voice for some water to be brought to her. However, the woman, hearing this, only laughed and asked, "Does she really think that someone will bring her water?" And also advised to her, just get off liquid from the ground. Then Christy, having gathered a little strength, looked at her stepmother and said that she was getting married in order to put an end to the war, and if she hurt her, then the empire of their enemy would not tolerate it. However, the girl did not have time to finish speaking, because her stepmother shut her up, saying that, firstly, if they found out about her gift, everyone would think that she had treacherous intentions. She explained that they could pretend they didn't know about it and let her get married. However, only after her stepmother made her experience the same, even worse, suffering that her son Elmar had endured. The woman looked incredibly angry and crazy. She said that she would simply kill her, so she certainly shouldn't beg for mercy. After this, the stepmother finally left, leaving Christy alone with her thoughts, grief, and pain. She thought about what her brother Elmar had to endure, but came to the conclusion that until she killed the man who ordered his death, she would not be able to die in peace. And so, quite a lot of time passed from that moment, and the stepmother returned to Christy again. As soon as her stepmother saw that the puddle that had been under the girl had completely disappeared, she asked if she had really licked water from the ground. She also asked with horror in her voice how great her thirst must have been. Christy, of course, did not respond to this. She already felt incredibly humiliated, so she was not going to stoop any lower. Then the mother came up to her and said that the girl was too arrogant and that it irritated her. At that moment, the doors to her dungeon opened, and one of the people who had provided her with torture began to enter. He first pushed the girl, and then grabbed her by the hair. Meanwhile, the mother came up to them and said that she had thought of something very good to have some fun. She led the girl to the mirror and said that she would rip off her skin and show it to Elmar's grave. With a smile on her face, the girl also said that she believed that this child would definitely be happy about such an act. Of course, as soon as Christy heard all this, she was simply horrified. She miraculously managed to escape from the man's hands, despite the fact that he thus pulled out a clump of hair from the back of her head. The stepmother was immediately very surprised that the girl had the strength to do this. She continued to stand aside and just watch everything that was happening. Christy looked at her with an incredibly angry look and asked the woman to take her words back, because this statement was an incredible insult to the guy. As soon as her stepmother heard such disrespect towards herself, she became even more angry, but did not even say anything to her. Christy, meanwhile, moved away from the mirror and saw how she, pushing away from the terrible people, hit it, and cracks formed there. So she decided to take advantage of this wonderful opportunity and started banging her head against the glass with all her might. It cut her face, shards flew everywhere, and on these shards there was Christy's blood. Of course, her stepmother, as soon as she saw all this, was horrified. She moved as far away as possible and was shaking all over with fear. The woman's henchmen also stood aside and all trembled with fear, because they saw that Christy had her poisonous blood running down her face. Everyone present in that room understood perfectly well that if even a drop of this girl's blood got on their skin, they would die instantly. Christy herself, meanwhile, took a piece of glass, and moving it towards her hand, said that if they did not want to die, then it would be better for them not to move. Of course, no one even batted an eyelid when Christy walked between them. They were very afraid that the girl could do something terrible that would kill them all. When she finally passed them, she ran to the exit. She understood perfectly well that on this day, the pressman had to come to the royal palace in order to hear his answer. The guards who were standing at the exit immediately saw that she was escaping, so they ordered the others that they needed to catch her immediately. Christy, meanwhile, was already climbing to the very top to get out of this dungeon, and she kept thinking that she had to meet Prince Noah. And finally, after quite a long time and an incredible amount of effort, she reached the exit. However, what a disappointment she was met with on the other side of the door. When the girl opened it, she saw that the entire space was surrounded by guards who would never let her pass. For a while, they all stood and just looked at each other. Then one of the guards suddenly shouted to everyone else not to stand there, but to take her already. Christy understood that things were going to get bad, so she immediately started covering her face with her hands so that at least it wouldn't get hit as hard. When she opened her eyes the next time, she saw that she was lying on the ground, with a man on top of her with a huge iron shield and doing everything so that she couldn't even move. Christy started screaming and asking them to let her go, and also asked, "Do they all really want to die immediately from her poison in their bodies?" But at that moment, her stepmother came to the surface and with a smile on her face asked what she was going to do when she went outside. Christy then turned her head to the side and said that she was going to marry Prince Noah, at which point the guards had already tied her hands so that she would not do anything. Her stepmother, hearing this phrase, immediately laughed and asked even more, was she still hoping for marriage? But she also added that she had already sent a letter of refusal to the Empire, so she had better forget about these illusions. The knights immediately began to drag the girl back into the dungeon, and the stepmother, turning around, replied that she would not tolerate either her marriage or her alliance with the Empire. Christy couldn't believe that it had actually happened. She remembered Noah's face as she lay in prison and couldn't believe that he had really given up on marrying her so easily, but she couldn't understand how this could happen. After all, it was he who insisted that their union take place and proposed to her first. Christy tried to move towards the puddle that had appeared again in her prison. She was very thirsty, so she simply had no choice. At that moment, the girl only thought that she did not want to die in such a terrible place, so she was going to fight for her life to the end. At this very time, Noah was halfway to Christy's house in order to figure out what was going on, because this letter had alarmed him. Before getting closer to the estate, he opened his helmet and looked around, sighing heavily. He realized that it had been a long time since he had been there last, so it was like nostalgia for him. When he finally arrived at the estate, the king immediately came out to meet him, and they decided to have a conversation. Noah was the first to turn to the king and ask if he had heard from Princess Christa about the situation they had discussed earlier. The king, immediately smiling nervously, said that, of course, he also accepted all the conditions, so much so that he was even ready to give up his daughter. Of course, Noah was very disappointed by these words because he could not believe that this man had no pride, like a king. Noah began to examine him from head to toe and came to the conclusion that if the king looked like that, then most likely he was very weak in battle. The reason why the princess came to the battlefield herself was probably because of their peaceful, carefree attitude. However, of course, the boy was still surprised by the situation. He believed that they must all have thought that they could stop the war by showing him kindness, the thought of a princess who had grown up in love. Of course, normally he wouldn't have taken all this seriously, but when she kissed him, he thought about it all seriously. A day later, he was back in his previous bad state, but this girl, in his opinion, had some kind of magical power that took away his pain. Noah, remembering all this, immediately turned to the king, interrupting his monologue, and asked, "Is the princess not ready yet?" After all, he thought that she would also go down with her father. The man apologized to him and said that apparently the preparations took a long time, so she would have to stay a little longer. At that moment, he himself understood that if he said that Princess Christa was missing, then the kingdom of Bran would come to an end. He was very angry and did not understand where she was at all because he had not seen her for several days. There was an awkward silence between the two of them for several anxious minutes, and then the king stood up and offered to show the man the garden, for there were rare flowers growing in the royal garden that were not found in the empire, and it might be interesting to see them. Noah, rising from his seat, replied that he understood everything, and also added that he would wait about another half hour. But if Princess Christie did not appear by that time, it would be considered that a betrayal was planned against the empire. The king, bowing, immediately said that he would definitely speed up her preparations so that the prince would not have to wait long under any circumstances. Noah, meanwhile, had indeed gone into the garden. He still hadn't taken off his armor and looked quite frightening. The man wondered what kind of preparation could take such a long time. Christie's silhouette appeared in front of his face in his memory, and he even thought that perhaps she was afraid of marriage, and that was why she was not walking for so long. But at that moment, not far from Noah, the workers of this estate were trying to calm a horse that did not want to obey them at all and resisted all the time. But the guy got tired of seeing all this, and he felt sorry for the animal, so, coming closer to them, he pushed one of the people who were looking after the horse aside. After this, with just one jump, he was able to saddle this horse and immediately tried to calm the poor animal. The man began to stroke her mane and asked the horse to calm down, and the animal really began to obey him and eventually stood as if nothing had happened. The people who were looking after this horse immediately ran up to the knight and thanked him, and also said that he had helped them out very well. Noah meanwhile looked at them and said that there were so many people in this place, but they were all so worthless that it irritated him to no end. People immediately began to ask him for forgiveness, but the guy ignored them because he began to feel bad again. His head was spinning, and his heart began to hurt again. One of his companions immediately asked if he had been injured by accident, but the guy replied that everything was fine. He was more interested in why the horse had gone so crazy. The people answered that they did not know, because usually she was quite calm. After all, they, as always, wanted her to go and eat some meadow grass, but the horse suddenly became very restless. Noah did not listen to all this anymore. He walked along the river. The horse caretakers immediately became worried and asked where he was going. But Boy ignored there. Near the water, he leaned down and suddenly saw a squirrel lying completely unconscious. He straightaway same thought about that she dead. However, when he touched her body, he immediately saw that the squirrel was simply unconscious. He immediately thought that there must have been something nearby that was emitting poison, and that was the reason the squirrel behaved like that, just like the horse.